Well, good morning, everybody.
Great. Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. We're just getting sort of things organized now. Can you hear me? I'm Jonathan Lee.
Yes, I can hear you.
Great. Okay. Nice to see you, Claire. Nice to see you, Nadir. Thanks, everyone. Samuel, nice to see you too. Thanks, everyone, for joining. We're still sorting out the technology here, but should be ready to start in a few minutes.
Thank you. Thank you.
Claire, can you hear me?
Yes.
Imran, who was hoping to join in person, is having to join online, is having trouble connecting. Would you mind connecting with him, just sharing what you did?
Sure, I can do that.
Thanks.
Unmute. There you go. You're off mute.
Hi, am I audible? I'm here.
Yes, you are.
Hi, we can all hear you. Can you hear us? Yes?
So maybe. She's right. It's relatively close to the I think people like themselves. Welcome everyone. Apologies for the delay, just sorting out various issues, technical issues here. I'm really pleased to see all of you, to have all of you joining us for this session today. As you know, the focus of the session is on approaches to creating evidence-based policy, and in particular to doing that in a collaborative way. Now, this is something that is at the core of the International Growth Center. I'm Jonathan Leap, I'm the Executive Director of the International Growth Center, and this is something that we were really set up to try to foster. And I think one of the things that we want to focus on today is not just the products of that, and we have some exciting research to share, but also to engage both on the research side and on the policy and stakeholder side with the process, and what is it that makes this process successful? What is it that enhances its value on both sides, that helps to generate better, more insightful, more important research? And what is it that enables it to feed more directly and more usefully into policy? And I think one of the lessons that we've learned over the past 15 years at the International Growth Center is that this collaboration is not by any means a process that focuses just on the final outputs. It's not about sharing results. It's a process about collaboration that starts even before the research idea exists, even before a particular policy challenge might exist. And it's one that's bringing together a range of stakeholders and researchers to be thinking about these problems together, and to, in that process, to begin to generate an agenda of what are the key policy challenges, where can research feed most usefully into those policy challenges. So it's a process that involves not just individual research projects, but it involves thinking about strategies, it involves thinking about research agendas, it involves thinking about how research itself is carried out, the participative nature of that research, and how the value, both in terms of its research and the depth of the insights, but also in terms of how it supports policymaking in constructive ways, is all very important. I'm delighted that we have such a strong group of speakers today to really help us to explore these areas. As you know from the program, we'll start with presentations on the research side, and then we'll hand over to presentations on the policymaker and stakeholder side. All of the presentations will be 10 minutes. I ask you to keep strictly to that limit to make sure everyone has an equal chance. Let me now just briefly introduce each of our speakers, and I'll start with the first part of the session, which will be the three on the research side, and then go to the policy side. On the research side, leading off will be Anton Heil, who is here in the room with us. Anton's been working on these issues for a number of years now. He's collaborated closely with Robin and Oriana and others, and we'll be talking about this research around policy interventions in particular to improve social outcomes, but particularly around policy. We also have Munshi Suleiman. Munshi is someone who began his career in BRAC in the Research and Evidence Division, and then has worn a number of really important hats across particularly the third NGOs in really promoting research in different contexts, and is now back with the BRAC Institute of Governance and Development as research director there. And then finally, we'll have Imran Matin, Imran himself has been deeply involved in this research, particularly around graduation for many years, very close collaborator with Robin and Oriana, and is currently the executive director of BIGD in Dhaka. So really delighted to have these three leading us off in the research session. And then we'll shift to the policy context. And helping to set the scene for us there will be Paolo Bentley. Paolo is a practice manager for social protection and jobs at the World Bank, and focused particularly on Eastern and Southern Africa. But he too has been working in this area for many years and brings a cross-country perspective. It's a particular pleasure for me to introduce Paolo because he did his PhD here at the school. So we've known each other for many years. We will then have Haris Gazdar, who is the special assistant to the chief minister in the Sindh province in Pakistan, with responsibility for social protection. So brings a lot of practical experience around policies in this area that he's going to be able to share with us, focusing particularly on linkages between women's agricultural work and children's health and nutrition and related areas. We have Nadir Gulbaresh joining us. He is the Chief Operating Officer of the Pakistan Poverty Alleviation Fund, which is the lead institution in Pakistan for community-driven development. But he too has been involved in rural development issues and poverty alleviation initiatives for a number of years and brings a deep understanding of those issues. They are very involved in Pakistan as part of that. Then we're delighted to have Samuel Yumva, who is the permanent secretary of the Ministry of Local Government in Rwanda. He's been in that post since 2019 and very active in promoting the social protection agenda there, and previously was in the Ministry of Public Service and Labor. But as you know, Rwanda has been in many respects a pace setter in Africa, and we're delighted to have Samuel with us. Finally, we have Rahul Kumar. He's a member of the IAS, currently based in Bihar. He is the Chief Executive Officer of the Bihar Rural Livelihoods Promotion Society, but that's one of several hats he wears. He's a commissioner for NREGA and has been deeply involved in women's empowerment and rural development issues. He's also received a number of rewards in recent years for his efforts. So Rahul, really, we're delighted to have you as well. And then I also want to introduce Claire Hutchings. She is the MEL director at BRAC for the graduation initiative. And although she's not going to be speaking in one of the slots, she's going to be joining us actively in the discussion. So Claire, really nice to have you too. Good. Okay. Well, that's all I wanted to say by way of introduction. So let me hand over now to Anton for the first presentation.
So I'm going to talk from here. If that's okay. I'll put the slides on. All right, let me start while we're sorting this out. I don't know if guys on the Zoom can see me or hear me, at least. That's more important. So
yes, yeah.
I want to talk about poverty traps a little bit. And I want to talk just very shortly about what are poverty traps, what's a bit of the empirical evidence that we have, and some of the policy implications, and hopefully they will help us to frame or maybe understand better some of the reasons why graduation programs work or in which contexts they work. And then we're going to hear a bit more detail on graduation programs from Munshi in the next lecture. So what's a poverty trap? So we have this vague notion of it that is some form of like a self-perpetuating cycle of poverty where the cause of poverty is poverty itself. So if you're poor today, that causally makes the person more likely to be poor also in the future. But I think it pays off to dig in a little bit and try to understand what is it that creates this cycle of self-perpetuating poverty. And I think here it kind of makes sense to think of poverty or as the defining feature of poverty in terms of income or low earnings. And then think of whatever is this question mark as some form of capital, something that can be accumulated over time. And different theories of poverty traps, different types, will point to different things here of what this question mark is or what it is that people accumulate or fail to accumulate that keeps them stuck in the cycle. So the traditional idea is can be nutrition, could be health, could be psychology. So really one of the first ideas for poverty traps, this idea that you have too little income to buy enough food, so you don't eat well, and then the next day you're hungry, you don't work, you can't work energetically, you earn even less money to buy more food and you're stuck in the cycle. Right? That's kind of the very basic idea. And similar stories can be told about health, about psychology, where people are stuck in certain mindsets or low aspirations, etc. So one thing I should point out with all of these is that, well, let me tell you what's not sufficient for this to create a trap, which is if there's a relationship between, if there's causal relationship that low income makes you unhealthy, and being unhealthy makes you have low income, that in itself is not enough to create a trap, right? So we see these relationships, but for a trap, what we also need is a certain shape of the relationship between these two things, where we, in academia, we talk of a nonlinear relationship, where there's kind of a threshold value. And the reason for that is that if very small investments, for example, in your health or in your nutrition, have very high returns in terms of income, and that means that slowly people can take a little share of the income that they have today, invest it in their nutrition, and then slowly save their way out, right? And that can happen. There's this relationship that goes back and forth, but still there's no trap. So the trap happens in a situation where very small investments have also really small returns, while much larger investments in whatever it is that we think of as capital here have much higher returns, right? And then we get this type of shape of the relationship where people might be trapped because they only have very little to invest today, and the return to that is so low that they have even less tomorrow. So one thing about these poverty traps is that they create these threshold values of income or of wealth below which people are stuck. So that's an important insight here, and I think, and that leads us to a different type of poverty trap, which is like this type of large investments that really pay off in terms of productive activity that poor people can't make. And we can think of it as a very visual example where, the total cost of buying 100 chickens might be the same as the total cost of buying a cow. But of course, for someone who's kind of poor in a rural place, it's much easier to buy one chicken now and then buy another chicken in a couple of weeks. And then, over time, they might be able to buy 100 chickens. But because the return to one chicken, it's much less than would be the return to the hundredth of a return to a cow. So in other words, it really pays off to have that one cow rather than having 100 chickens, right? But they never get there because saving up to buy the cow is much more difficult. Like this big chunk of an investment is much harder to get than, slowly over time buying one chicken after another. And that's kind of the story that I think we should have in mind often. That's the idea of these indivisible investments that also transfers to other types of capital we can talk about here. And then there's other types, like you might be stuck in a certain location, in a place where you're very exposed to risk, in a place of low social capital as well. So all these are different types. Now, one other thing to point out here is we have all these potential different types of traps. I think one crucial insight is that multiple of those can bind at the same time. And now coming back to the graduation program, I think that's one of the foundational insights behind the graduation program is that multiple of these constraints can bind at the same time. People can be trapped in multiple ways. If you only go along one dimension, it might not be very effective. So policies should be designed essentially to have that in mind. Okay, so key points taking away from this, what I call the theory part, is that if there's a poverty, there's a threshold, and that means that only big investments can make a difference in the long run. Small investments will kind of dissipate over time. People will fall back to the situation where they're coming from. But at the same time, that means that the trap is always also an opportunity, right? So that means that these big investments can be made. And we think of a poverty trap as a bad thing, but in a different way, if there's a poverty trap, that also gives us an explanation of why people are persistently poor that doesn't have to refer to the individual characteristics of these people, right? Well, the poverty traps theory tells us is that if we observe these populations being poor over long periods of time, it's not necessarily because there's something inherently specific about these people. It is just that they're in a bad situation. And the trap can be released in a sense. Right? So in a way, that what defines the trap is also the opportunity to get people out of it. And then finally, this idea that multiple traps combine at the same time, and I'll get back to it a little bit. So what's the empirical evidence? This has been studied in different settings. The kind of a little bit older literature has looked at panel data, observational data, looking at the dynamics of how assets or income evolve over time. And this has given a bit of a mixed picture, where in some contexts, evidence for poverty traps have been found, mostly in very kind of remote settings where people really just do one type of job. But I think one reason why this literature has been a little bit mixed is because simply the types of shocks that we see that would, are just too small to push people out of the trap or into the trap if we just observe people as they are. Then there's a literature on the just effects of the graduation programs. And in particular, there's one paper I'm citing here is looking at the 10-year impact. So there's a really long impact, and just the simple fact that if we have a pure control group and a treatment group over 10 years, and even after 10 years, the control group doesn't catch up, that's kind of not conclusive, but it's suggestive evidence that maybe they're just stuck in a trap, right? If we see these treatment effects persist over such a long period of time. And then some of our work is that using Brack's graduation program in Bangladesh, we look at evidence of what happens to these people. We know that the program evaluation tells us that the program was effective at helping a lot of people out of extreme poverty, but then we're looking more specifically just restricting at the treatment group, and this is around, what I'm showing you is kind of around 3,500 households from the treatment group, and we're plotting their productive assets, so that's everything that they own that they can use to make money on, stuff like livestock, poultry, vehicles, business, other types of business assets. And what we see when we plot this in two time periods, that is in 2007 against 2011, that the people who have, we get this very characteristic S shape of a poverty trap. That means that people who have very little initially end up losing assets over time, whereas those that have more initially, accumulate more assets over time. So here we see this kind of, the treatment group splits almost into two groups at a threshold, and we call this a poverty threshold. So as I said earlier, this is kind of the threshold behavior where if you're above a certain point of wealth, in this case, we're looking at physical capital, people seem to take off, whereas if you're below, people fall back into it. So we take this as another piece of evidence for that poverty traps can exist in some contexts. In particular, this might explain why why the graduation program was effective for these people. Then we have some other, one more minute. All right, in that case, let me just show you some little bits on how this threshold is different for different subgroups of the population. So we see that it's a lower threshold in villages that are in general more productive. It's a lower threshold for women that have more education. It is lower for those that report being less anxious in general. And it's also, it's not even there for people who report having been to the local market in the last year. So again, what this points to is that this is kind of multidimensional nature of poverty. It's not only that you need more assets, but also different other characteristics can shift this threshold around. And I think that's kind of interesting for policy. So let me end with this, because it tells us a little bit like, or it might help us get towards an idea of where these kind of constraints might be more binding and where people are more likely to be trapped. So Yeah, so then we'll
We can talk through those and then we'll.
All right.
We can do, yeah.
Yeah, so in general, so I think these are the kind of the interesting first questions maybe for discussion that come out of this for me is like where and when, are people trapped potentially? We think it has to do a lot with the occupation that they're actually doing and whether the physical aspects that they have lock them in a certain type of occupation in the place where they are. And then obviously if there's this type of trap, we should think about what is a good transfer size to get people out of it. And that's probably a relevant policy question in every setting. So I think I want to not overtake my thing. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Anton. Munshi, sorry, I'm going to try to keep us to time, just to make sure everyone gets time. Munshi, can we hand over to you?
Thank you. Let me share the screen. Thanks, Anton. So I'm kind of trying to sort of talk about something building on what Anton has talked about with respect to poverty trap. So this is based on a sort of from a work that was done a while ago. It's a bit dated, back in 2016-17. But I think the sort of findings, the narratives are possibly still relevant for the discussions. So this is kind of a synthesis. Now, given that, I mean, poverty trap, we talk about it in the literature, but more in practice, whenever we're trying to think of any interventions, any design discussions that I've been part of, it invariably comes in that there is a notion of poverty trap. Sometimes we talk about it as some structural break or whatever. And then sort of from there, we try to design some interventions. Now, of course, for poverty, graduation is not the only way, and should not be, and income is not the only thing. We do things from sort of livelihood supports, cash transfers to a lot of sort of complex interventions, or sort of completely unrelated, not completely unrelated, but seemingly unrelated interventions like mental health support that can break poverty trap, all of that. So the idea here, what I want to talk about quickly is to sort of see where graduation stands compared to the sort of the immediate contenders of other sets of interventions that have similar objectives of breaking this sort of income poverty trap. So it's comparing graduation, cash transfer, and sort of a baggage, different sets of livelihood interventions. But before going there, very quickly on the graduation, I mean, there are many ways to describe the graduation program. Many people sort of conceptualize it in many different ways. So this is one of the ways. So it's sort of seen as a holistic intervention with 4 pillars. In fact, Partnership for Economic Inclusion has sort of a lot of toolkits, outputs. Prax UPGI initiative also has been sort of coming up with various sort of description of the model. But I mean, for me, if I see the 4 pillars, personally, I feel the livelihood promotion is probably one of the most load-bearing beer, if you like, the sort of pillar way of thinking about it. And then the sort of the financial inclusion, it comes in as a way of supporting those enterprises that are that these sort of ultra-poor households get involved in, how to improve the productivity of those households, of those enterprises, of the small businesses, or they don't fail or exit from those enterprises. Social empowerment has sort of covers a lot of things ranging from rights to social norm changes as a way to maybe in many ways to sort of influence the threshold that Anton was talking about. And then finally, social protection sometimes is seen as one of the quote unquote exit way, that it doesn't, after graduation, that's not the end, because they're not like, they don't need any more support. And there are sort of key features. There are a few key features that the graduation program has. One is focusing on targeting and then trying to customize the intervention based on their needs and context. very closely monitor, supervised, or as we like to call it, as hand-holding, and then sort of creating a graduation pathway. So that's the graduation we are talking about. Now going to the comparison. So we can do graduation, we can do cash transfer. So for this particular systematic review, what we try to look at are at the cash transfers that that involve a lump sum one-off transfer, with the hope of or with the sort of theory of change that this injection of capital will enable them to get involved in enterprises and reduce poverty. So it's not any sort of cash transfer that is done as kind of conditional cash transfer, delivered in installments, or cash transfer as safety nets. That's not the type of cash transfer we looked at. And then livelihood promotion, we had about 30 odd livelihood promotion interventions that ranges from farmers field school, value chain initiatives, small scale irrigation facility, etc. And the graph here is just to show the sort of the distribution of these cases. So we have about 50 cases here, the cost and the scale. So this descriptive kind of shows one important point. So when we talk about graduation, quite often we hear that it's an expensive program. But if you look at the sort of cost and the distribution of the beneficiaries, so these are in log scale, so 3 means 1,000, 6 means a million beneficiaries, you see that yes, it seems like many of these graduation are high cost, although the India Bangladesh ones are below $500. But there are many other livelihood programs that are implemented at a really large scale and are quite expensive. Actually, we had to sort of drop a few of the outliers because it didn't fit in even with this log scale. So that's kind of one point, that graduation on the face of it may look very expensive, but when you compare it to the other things that we're doing quite often by multilateral or bilateral donors, it's not necessarily the most expensive. The cash transfers were mostly research studies, so the amount of transfer ranged between $150 to $400 or so. Now, what is the impact evidence? So for the impact, so we are looking at a simplified indicator where we're looking at the impact on income or consumption, so preferably consumption, but if consumption wasn't available, we looked at income for every dollar spent. And it was impact at one period of time, so we didn't do any counting of how long the benefit can last. We didn't count for other potential benefits. For example, for graduation, we often see the amount of asset increase is typically higher than the amount of and the value of the asset or the livestock that was transferred. So that already itself kind of shows a more than 100% sort of benefit because they are holding on to the assets and growing it. But for simplicity, if we just look at the consumption, annual consumption, and the sort of ratio to per dollar spent, it does seem like a cash transfer is much better. So you get a 0.3, so that means for every dollar, you get a social return of 30 cents. Graduation is for below, it's around 10 cents if you look at only consumption. Livelihood is in between. There are some interesting variations within livelihood. Programs that target the poorest seem to have slower impact, where we look at consumption have lower impact than sort of average. More importantly, where we look at the impact beyond 1 year, just post-intervention. So as soon as we look at the livelihood interventions that were evaluated at least a year after the intervention ended, we see the impact goes down. So the sustainability essentially is the key.
Munshi, so could you finish in 2 minutes, please?
Right, thank you. So the so essentially, this 0.3, even if the best estimate is taken, we need to have this benefit continue at least for 3 or 4 years to equalize the investments. So the question is, this is what is happening in the short term, but what does happen in the long run? So there are a bunch of papers or studies that were included in that summary have had sort of further follow-up surveys, and that's where sort of things look more real. Most of the cash transfers, except for one actually, all the sort of impact that are observed in the short term dissipate very soon. So after 2 years, 3 years, you don't see those impacts. So if simple cash transfer is done as a tool for poverty reduction, we don't see the long-term impact. But for graduation, we do have some substantial long-term evidence, 10 years, 14 years, and actually some of the assumptions that we had to make, back in 2004-5 when we did benefit cost calculation to come to this estimate of about $3 return for every dollar spent, are actually turning out to be the true as we look at the evidence in the long term. And there are also some studies that have done sort of direct comparison of graduation and cash transfer on the same side, on the same sort of side. And that also kind of confirms this narrative. But the other important point here, as my last point, is it doesn't have to be the simplest cash transfer versus a more complex graduation. In some of these studies, we also see that if you can bring in some of the elements of graduation within the social protection program, you get additional benefits in terms of impact on the poor households. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Munshi. Imran, over to you.
Sorry, he's muted.
Yeah, it looks like you're muted, Imran.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, so thanks, Munshi and Anton. What I'll try and do is just provide a few thoughts in terms of really focusing on government-led graduation, and what do we know and what do we need to know. So firstly, I think the future of graduation approach has to be government-led social protection integration. Right? I mean, that's how we can really, take our graduation approach forward. And the reason why this is really critical is, I think social protection and graduation ultimately is a government mandate. I mean, this is really about why governments exist. Governments really, this is very much central to any government's public policy. Social protection and safety net are central to any state building and the raison d'etre of any public policy and sort of government. So from that point of view, I think, it really has to be, the future has to be, how do we really integrate the graduation approach within social protection, and it is led by government. And I think it's also important from a few other point of view, aside from the core responsibility and core, mandate of government. And I think the other two is, I think it's also really important because the graduation approach really starts looking at social protection as investment. And I think this is also really, really critical. And Munshi just now talked about, the longer term return that we basically see, and it sort of ranges from, 300 to 400% over a range of 4 to 5 years. So that's a really strong return on investment of this graduation approach. And what that basically does, it starts releasing resources from, if you take a more of a productive oriented approach towards social protection, releasing resources for the more protective social protection and safety net that is also required to mitigate against different types of risk that any society faces, right? So from a the more we can find ways of creating effective, productive social protection, in the long run, we save resources to be able to invest in the protective safety net and social protection that is really required. And I think that is smart politics as well. So I think that's another reason why this is really important for this to be government-led. And the third is, and I think hasn't really talked about much, but we see this in the context of Bangladesh a lot, is actually the heart of the graduation approach is also crowding in other forms of informal and community-based safety net and informal social protection that basically exists. So this can also be a way in which local government and local governance can start becoming more pro-poor as well. So I think this element of the graduation approach hasn't been researched as much, but I think it's really important to sort of highlight from a government-led imperative, because local government, local governance, and making that more pro-poor is also quite central to I think the government-led graduation I think way of thinking about it. So I want to start off with that. Now, I think we talked about the pillars of graduation approach, and I don't want to get into that. But what I want to do next is talk a bit about kind of the what we're doing in terms of what the Ultra Poor Graduation Initiative, the PEI, and others are sort of working around the world in terms of working with different governments. Right now, it's adopted by 15 different governments across Latin America, South Asia, and Africa. And across 50 countries, this is going on, but 15 different governments. And it's really important, obviously, to focus that, the trade-offs that the government faces are quite different from the way in which, sort of NGO-led graduation approach. And I think we need to perhaps talk, much more about this, and hopefully we'll get into some of this conversation in terms of the fiscal trade-off, the capacity trade-off, and the political trade-off. And I think those are the three domains of trade-off that we need to basically look at, because I did talk about that in the mid to longer run, this releases resources, but there's investment proposition in the short term. So that does create kind of fiscal and political trade-offs, and there is very strong capacity trade-off sort of as well, because as we build, there are capacity investment that would have to be made to be able to do this effectively. And right now there are at least I think 3 state government very exciting work is going on with BRAC, with India, with state government of Bihar, with the Jivika program, with Pakistan, Rwanda, and also Ethiopia. I think there's some really interesting conversation going on. I would like to end with a few thoughts about the future evidence agenda, and we can get into details around the discussion later. So one is, I think Anton talked about the threshold, right? I mean, the heterogeneity of threshold is really important, because so the idea of threshold has been evidenced quite strongly, but I think the heterogeneity of where the threshold lies is also very important, right? To have more evidence on, because that directly affects the cost effectiveness of and the investment that we basically need to put in. So we need to get smarter and more precise about the threshold variation. And I think it's really interesting, the early work that we basically see right now in terms of where we see the variations, how the meso economy really matters. The more vibrant the meso economy, the lower the threshold. Makes intuitive sense. So that basically means in more difficult meso market situations, we need higher level of threshold here, and I think that's really important. Climate context is going to be really important as well, because I think climate context, the threshold, how that behaves in a climate vulnerable context, I think that's going to be really important. For households with certain types of particular context, such as person with disability, and how do you that would have a direct impact on threshold as well. So I think the threshold heterogeneity and understanding where the threshold lies, we need more evidence on that. And I think that would be really important. And related to the threshold variability, heterogeneity, is the whole question of cost recovery as well, right? Because in Bangladesh, I know there's experimentation going on, and more than experimentation, actually now the cost recovery is very much part of the mainstream graduation approach, and it seems to have quite high returns despite the cost recovery. But how do we design the cost recovery better? I think is going to be really, really important. And I think government-led graduation approaches can do this better, because they don't have to take a short-term kind of a programmatic or a kind of a perspective here. They can take a longer-term view in terms of the any potential for cost recovery. And I think cost recovery design is going to be really, really important as well.
Imran, could I ask you to finish up? Yeah.
Yes, I'm finishing up. And the last point I really wanted to make in terms of the evidence focus is, I think, is going to be really on understanding the plumbing and understanding the incentives through which government systems ultimately implement these type of programs, and really learning what works in that particular context. Because I think the whole plumbing and the incentives that is basically required to sort of weave in a graduation approach, building on existing programs, I think is going to be really important to understand very, very effectively and very well. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks very much, Imran, and thanks again, Munshi and Anton, for setting us up so nicely on the research side. So we're now going to switch to the policy context, and I'd like to ask Paolo Belli to lead us off. So as I mentioned before, Paolo's at the World Bank. He's the practice manager for social protection and jobs, with a focus particularly on Eastern and Southern Africa. Paolo.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, and great to see you again after so many years. And can you hear me well?
Yeah. Yes, we can.
Okay, wonderful. So let me just share a few reflections. So the reflections are part of them are sort of global, part of them are very specific to the region I cover. So I manage a program we have at the World Bank in social protection and jobs across a cluster of 13 countries in Eastern and Southern Africa. Now, what we have seen as I said, what I'm saying is very relevant, specific for our region. What we've seen in the last 3-4 years has been an explosion of interventions of economic inclusion interventions, and there are different reasons for this. But just to give you a sense of the magnitude of this explosion, we did a report, the State of Economic Inclusion 2021, that showed that across the world enumerate approximately 100 interventions across 90 countries. Now they are now updated, the same report, and now the count is up to almost 300 interventions. So there has been a growth. And so in the first part of my short talk, I'm going to explain what is, from my perspective, the reason behind what we see, but then focus mostly on the challenges that this new world we're in poses to us, and then discuss some of the trade-offs that I see emerging. So I was saying, one of the reasons why we see this really rapid growth in economic inclusions, pilots, but also scale up of existing interventions, and that actually I would say the latter has been more prevalent. So we have more and more governments that started very small, but over the last 2-3 years they are really trying to reach out many more beneficiaries. So they are scaling up by several orders of magnitude. And these developments, as we will see, pose really new also questions about the impact of this type of intervention. One of the reasons, as I said, is this comes on the back of the real rapid growth in coverage of cash transfers during the COVID crisis. So in many countries in Africa, in Eastern Southern Africa, particularly where I work, governments have responded to the crisis, and they also have heavily borrowed from the World Bank, but some of the governments have done it with their own funds. They've really scaled up their cash transfer interventions, moving the coverage further from the traditional areas, which was mostly rural areas with a focus on chronic poverty, into urban areas, informal sector workers, etc. So this expansion has also to some extent determined as also the Imran was saying before me, the current growth of economic inclusion program, because there has also been a pushback, I would say, particularly from Ministry of Finance and not only. And there is a sense also that there is a need to complement the income support with the activation support, so that more and more households hopefully will be able to, let's say, graduate out of this form of emergency support that in some countries would tend to become permanent. So one of the reasons, not the only reason, is that we see this growth in high intervention is because of this need to have a differentiated approach towards able to work population, and sometimes also perhaps an excessive hope that through, let's say, a set of wraparound services, some of these beneficiaries could be actually graduated out of poverty and of cash transfer support. Now, as I was saying, this growth poses enormous challenges. One of the speakers before me talked about the challenge also in terms of knowledge gaps. You know, we have a vast literature now, a first wave that has really proven the cost effectiveness of IE interventions, but now these are the new interventions that we see. They're much broader, as I said. They have a much more significant potential macroeconomic impact, but they also are sort of hitting constraints that perhaps the smaller interventions were not subject to, and I will go into those in a minute. One key challenge that I see, and I'm going to enumerate a few now. One key challenge that I see now is and I'm talking now, let's say, more from a perspective of social protection and job, is that we need more and more, we see in our institution the need to coordinate more and more with colleagues from other global practices and with other expertise, so that we also, you know, design this economic inclusion intervention in a more intelligent manner. One example is the agricultural colleagues. You know, we in social protection have the household as our unit of beneficiaries always. The other colleagues have a much clearer view of sectors or firms and their growth prospects. And so we are working more and more together with other colleagues to try to also tailor, let's say, the intervention, for example, in terms of access to markets to the value chains in agriculture that we see as most promising in each country, and the situation is different in different countries. So this is one development. A second development is that as we move into the urban space, there are new challenges emerging. One of them is that countries, for example, here, Kenya, where I sit, you know, they do have already a set of active labor market policies in place. And so the question there is how, you know, this new intervention, the economic inclusion intervention, can be linked and can be complementing other active labor market policies that are already in place. And so the idea there is really to try to create what is called a sort of a conveyor belt of services, so that beneficiaries can be that are already receiving some income support can be brought into economic inclusion programs, activation programs, but then can also be helped to upskill or reskill, and then can be helped in the intermediation in the labor markets, and can be subject, for example, can be beneficiaries of apprenticeship programs that are already in place in the country. So there is a whole new area of work where we're trying to link more, connect the dots, let's say, so that there is a continuous of interventions that beneficiaries can benefit from. A third set of issues is about the targeting issue. So the cash transfers were, as I was saying, you know, the original cash transfers in many countries were targeting chronically poor rural populations. And now, as we move into urban areas, no, we have, as I said, also in cash transfer, we've been facing the issues of expanding much more the pool of beneficiaries, but also with economic inclusion, this is further complicated because obviously we are now targeting able to work populations, and so the traditional methods of geographical targeting, of using PM team or community validation are not sometimes sufficient to actually, or they are too restricted to actually identify the right set of beneficiaries. Another challenge. Yes.
Finish in 2 minutes.
Yes, I'll need 2 minutes. So another challenge, and this is the last one I want to mention now, is that what is the final result? For a lot of people, the final result is actually self-employment and not really access to formal jobs. And so there is a whole debate coming up now in Africa about the issue of informality and how the trajectory of economic transformation in Africa may look very different from what we've seen happening, in Europe 100 years ago plus, and in East Asia recently. Now, some of the trade-offs that are really important, I hope we can discuss it during the next few minutes. One is between coverage and in-depth intervention. There is a big push to include more and more people, but sometimes that comes at a cost of depth. So that we know also from the Bragg literature, we need like a sustained and resource-intensive intervention to really make a difference, to make people get out of the poverty trap, as was explained by the first speaker. The risk that I see now is that as we expand these programs across, we tend to do it on the cheap, so to speak, and so there is a risk that some of the initial gains and results in terms of effectiveness will be lost. The second trade-off is really between a size-fit-all approach vis-a-vis a more, let's say, individual case management approach. So these people all face rather different constraints to access the labor market, for example. But again, because of administrative and other constraints, developing a true case management system where each individual can be given a slightly differentiated package becomes very challenging. So the tendency is to do one-size-fits-all type of approaches, but they tend to have lots of limitations, which are even more striking when one moves to urban areas. Another big trade-off is between leverage existing government systems and agencies. We will hear from PS Sam from Rwanda. This is the choice of Rwanda vis-a-vis using NGOs and other actors that may bring in also the international experience and expertise as is needed, but the intervention tend to be much more costly. So this is another, and the final trade-off that I think is we are trying to develop knowledge on this, is how can we leverage technology to reduce costs. And again, here there is a whole new set of evaluations happening about complementing in person with long distance approaches, for example, to learning and to intermediation services. And so these are some of the challenges that I wanted to share with you, and I hope that we will have an opportunity to discuss them. Over.
Great. Thanks very much, Paolo. Now, pleasure to introduce again Harris Gazdar, who is, I said earlier, is the Special Assistant to the Chief Minister in Sindh province in Pakistan with responsibilities for social protection.
I think you're muted.
Sorry,
So
we're not hearing you. We're not hearing you. But it doesn't appear that you're muted, so I'm not sure if there's a microphone issue. Yeah. No, we're not hearing you. I wonder if the best thing is we go to Nadir for his presentation and then come back to you, just to give you a few minutes to see if you can identify a problem. I don't think it's a problem on our end because we've been able to hear other speakers.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I'll just upload my presentation. Can you remove this presentation?
Thanks very much, Nadir. Okay, there we are.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. I'll try to make this. In fact, it is a bit long presentation. However, what I've done, I've put my notes also, so you can share with all participants. So I'll just try to catch up the key elements of the presentation. So this is basically Pakistan Poverty Alleviation Fund based on the social action program Lessons Learned, which was in late 80s, early 90s, and the Khan Rule Support Program and some other successful programs in poverty reduction. PPF was created by Government of Pakistan as an apex institution. Well, if you look at the poverty, so following the capability approach, poverty has arisen when people lack key capabilities and so have inadequate income or education, poor health, insecurity, or low self-confidence, or sense of powerlessness, or the absence of rights such as freedom of speech. This makes poverty a multidimensional phenomenon, and the achievement of social outcome is independent on inputs such as access to good education, healthcare facilities, housing, environment, and this is basically internationally also proven. In Pakistan, there had been a lot of policy initiative, National Sustainable Development Goal Framework. So look, these have been localized. Pakistan Vision 2030, its strategy includes inclusive growth by sustainably reducing the poverty and improving income distribution mechanism is the key pillar. And then Benazir Income Support Program, this is one of the largest social programming compared to many countries, which is basically a cash transfer, it's safety net. The Government of Pakistan has also created the Poverty Alleviation Coordination Council to reduce the inequalities, invest in people, and lift lagging districts. Created Alleviation and Social Safety Division. Launched the government's National Poverty Graduation Initiative in 2013, which includes assets transfers, the vocational and skill trainings, interest-free loans. And financial inclusion, Government of Pakistan committed more than 8 billion rupees, and Pakistan Poverty Alleviation Fund is implementing this program. The social protection paradigm remains mainly characterized cash transfer focused on smoothing designed to protect against temporary risk, and Benazir Income Support Program experience of unconditional cash transfer to eradicate poverty unless integrated into a more poverty graduation approach. So basically giving these monthly stipend or cash grants for the day-to-day expenses, but it has looked at that the people are not coming out of poverty, so it's basically giving them fish every month. And then in 2016, PPF basically engaged Government of Pakistan and international community to promote this holistic approach of graduation to alleviate poverty. Poverty targeting is very important. Number one is the targeting of area. So of 2-decade experience of delivering poverty alleviation programs where they are most needed, ensuring neutrality and impartiality. So our poverty mapping is rigorous methodology to identify where the poorest communities are. So it's basically the area identification. And second is multidimensional poverty map ranking districts by poverty head counts as per PPF's geography of poverty study. These are 4 strategies that we at PPF adopt to reduce poverty. And this is overall what we have done during last 2 decades. Our presence in almost 90% of the area, and more than 10 million people have benefited from the financial services. More than 200,000 families have benefited from the assets, and millions of people have benefited from the technical vocational skill. And one of the other initiatives that we have done is during past couple of years is investment in housing after the earthquake of 2005. Then in 2011, there was flood. And now in current flood, so housing is another. We have constructed more than 130,000 houses for the affectees of flood. So in fact, if you look at the graduation approach, so PPF basically from 2000 2005, our approach basically it was World Bank funded. It was focusing on creating social capital, institutional development, single product of microcredit, and stand-alone village infrastructure project. It was 96 districts, which is 60% of country's area, geographical area. And then we refined it to 2006 to 2009. It was multi-sector intervention, institutional development, water, energy, and health and education pilots. Emergency response and reconstruction obviously was one of the major because of the earthquake of 2005. Special program for social mobilization and then testing livelihood opportunities. In between 2010 and 17, it was more strategic depth, integrated, inclusive, multidimensional poverty, second generation institutional support for livelihood, scaling up asset creation, and poverty graduation testing. From 2018 to 2025, it's basically multiplying impact, scaling up poverty graduation from household to SMEs, impact investment on youth and rural entrepreneurs, and rural connectivity, virtual and physical infrastructure, and then leveraging the partnerships and impacting policies. So presence was in 149 districts, which is mostly 90% area of the country. So if you look at the poverty band, as per the Planning Commission of Pakistan, there are 5 poverty bands. So poverty scorecard 0 to 16, it's basically cash transfer, which is mainly Benazir income support program. So every year, more than 300 billion rupees are being given as a cash transfer through Government of Pakistan Social Protection Program. For asset creation and livelihood intervention, the vulnerable people, they are, it's basically according to poverty scorecard less than 23. So there are livelihood interventions, which is assets creation, training, skill vocational trainings, employment centers, production centers, development of enabling ecosystem, small infrastructure, energy, health, and education related. And then there is financial services, which is basically for people who are in the category of less poor. So there are common interest groups which are created as social capital, then asset strengthening, employment centers, production centers, value chain development, and marketing linkages. So this is basically through the financial services, which is mainly interest-free loan scheme. And then for people who are, one can say, is non-poor, in order to enhance the poverty reduction efforts to create more employment, this is where microfinance plus comes. And PPF is the sector developer in microfinance in Pakistan. So, and this package is for transitory poor, transitory vulnerable, pro-poor value chains, micro insurance products, creating entrepreneurs, access to need-based financial services, access to savings and banking services, and business expansion. And then in SME finance, business support, these are basically loans, technical capacity building, creation of network. And currently, we are providing grants to MSMEs to strengthen their value chains and create more employment opportunities. So PPF basically serves the purpose of our graduation approach. We have been trying to convince Government of Pakistan, and to some level, government has realized they have owned this graduation program. That this graduation model is basically an exit strategy of current Government of Pakistan Social Protection Initiative, which is called Benazir Income Support Program. If we look at the uptake of graduation model in Pakistan, so there have been many studies, like World Bank undertook a study in 2016. So the asset recipients earned incremental income of $500 to $1,300 annually. Technical and vocational skill that we imparted for the purpose of reducing poverty, it reported incremental income of around $800 per annum for the beneficiaries who got this training. Investment in livelihood entrepreneurs development led to internal rate of return of 138%. And net present value is positive in both social and economic terms. In 2013 to 18, randomized controlled trial on assets versus cash transfer and line result was the significant shift in occupational patterns, movement from wage employment to self-employment. And household earning from livestock-related businesses registered a significant increase in both treatment arms. Increase in consumption, saving, and investment for both treatment arms. In 2013, there was another program which was funded by Italian. It was called Program for Poverty Reduction. It focused on social and economic development for grassroots communities through development of small infrastructure, provision of health and education services, skill development training, and sustainable livelihood opportunities.
Nadia, could I ask you to finish up? So we've just come to the 10 minutes.
Okay. So the results are 42%. These are results of the same study. I'm just trying to explain that basically the graduation model, it really works. And these are other studies that have been undertaken. So you can share these presentation with other colleagues also. And we are also working with the same model of to graduate Afghan refugees in Pakistan, adopting the same approach of graduation. And this is jointly with UNHCR. And these are some of the other impact of various programs that PPF has implemented. One of the lessons learned that we have is basically whenever you try to graduate household level poverty, you address that. But all of a sudden, you know, if there is any health problem in the family, or there is any a disaster, for example, a recent flood or earthquake. So this is zero-sum game. So what we are trying to do now is we are creating some packages for insurance of agriculture and livestock products mainly. And also in terms of infrastructure, we are now educating with government and national community that the effect of these flood have been very worse. So providing, you know, housing and shelter for these people which are earthquake resilient and flood resilient. So if we are able to provide the support, only then we'll be able to take these initiatives forward and address the poverty through the graduation approach. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much. So I think that Harrison is now able to give his presentation. So we'll switch to him now.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Great. Thanks very much.
Okay, great. Okay, so thanks. I'm very sorry about the hitch. I won't take very much of your time. I want to basically talk about my learnings from experience of working with in the academic area, and then working as a consultant, and then also political engagement, and then policy engagement. And what I want to talk about today is that there are several types of evidence. So I'm actually basically responding to the question that was posed about evidence. And on the basis of my own understanding, there are at least 3 types of areas of evidence that are important. So actually, can you move to the other slide? I want to actually start from there. Laura? Yeah. So I want to set up this problem, or set up my presentation in the following way. So there are evidence and its types, and evidence, the dictionary definition is a fact or body of information to indicate if a proposition is true or valid. Now, inside of all of that, there is actually quite a lot of stuff. And there are at least 3 levels of decision making in social policy where evidence is routinely marshaled. So this is actually a response to the frustration that we sometimes feel as scientific researchers or academics about demand for evidence, right? So a lot of programs, a lot of the research funding, it is linked to having demand for evidence, and then the scientists responding to that demand. And what I found in my engagement with government engagement that has been both fulfilling and very frustrating. And I'm very glad to hear that Imran and other colleagues are also advocating the importance of government in all of this. So an important learning for me has been that rarely anything moves in government without evidence. So evidence is ubiquitous and at different levels. So you actually now, as a practitioner or as a researcher, you have to identify different epistemologies. And I want to actually break out of the kind of an academic language, but basically to say that there are at least three areas or three levels of decision making in social policy where evidence is routinely used. And the one that we are familiar with in the present milieu is science. So, and what is evidence there? It is basically, it develops through the epistemology of the discipline that you're working with. So if you're an economist, you have some very clear ideas about what evidence is. And those ideas shift gradually as the scientific discipline itself changes. Then at the second level, there is policy. And here I think evidence is routinely required and marshaled. But what kind of evidence really depends on the institutional and political framing. So what are the available opportunities for change at that given moment in time? And what facts or bodies of information matter most, right? So there is no, so you're moving away from some of the certainties of science and moving into the world of negotiation. And it's the art of negotiation and understanding of where the openings are, and then what kinds of evidence matter. And very often the evidence that matters has very little to do with what we understand to be scientific evidence, right? So it could be evidence that is deemed to be legitimate within that institutional setting. So to give you an example, I will actually illustrate all of this with respect to an important social protection problem that we're facing, which we have faced in the past and we're facing again. And the important thing is to know how any of these variables might change, right? So here is where the art or the entrepreneurship is quite important, because a lot of these rules, a lot of the epistemology of knowing the truth changes in the policy realm over time through political entrepreneurship, through institutional entrepreneurship. And, so there are very different ways in which we can see this working. And the final level, which I think is the most the least understood and actually perhaps the most critical one, it is at the level of the action or the activity. Virtually no government decision, and I think that's also true with programs run by NGOs and others, can actually function without constantly ascertaining facts on the ground and constantly adjudicating on those facts, right? So the issue of evidence is critically important in the management of any program of any type. You can anticipate that this is true, obviously, of targeting, where the identification of a beneficiary and the verification of the information the beneficiary gives, or whatever information you have, is critically important for the quality of targeting. But actually, there is virtually, I cannot think of a single social policy or a social program where operational rules can be actually implemented, or organizations can work without routinely assessing facts, defining what a fact is for them, and defining rules of how we ascertain a fact. And then also from the action side or the activity side emerges the problem, right? So the problem statement, if it emerges from the action side, you have some chance of actually affecting policy. So this hierarchy that I have, I've written science at the top, then policy and in the middle, and action at the bottom. But actually it's like a circle, so you could actually start anywhere. And if we're looking for the demand for evidence, the surest place to find it is where the action is. That's really where disaffection with what we are doing things now arises, where it is articulated, and from where possible responses or the possible opportunities or the options between which you will be able to choose, they are also shaped. So this is basically my understanding. I've looked at other frameworks of looking at evidence. Unfortunately, a lot of those frameworks are still designed or conceptualized by academics, by scientists. And scientists have the most systematic way of thinking about evidence. And I think that perhaps one of the most powerful ways of thinking about evidence. But actually the problem is that in terms of policy change and in terms of change of action, perhaps we lack a nuanced understanding of how facts are established, what the rules are for establishing facts are. So if you can move to the other slide, I'll give you some of this understanding with respect to this example, this particular example that we have. Thank you. So the challenge is for us, and as Mr. Nadir has very eloquently described, we are in Pakistan now, I guess, in the 15th year of a very, very big and established social protection program in the form of the Benazir Income Support Program. And we now have very ambitious provincial programs, at least in 2 provinces, which is Punjab and Sindh, which are trying to complement the efforts of the Benazir Income Support Program. Now, I want to talk first historically about a problem that was faced and how it was solved and where we are with respect to that problem again. The action was that before the Benazir Income Support Program came, the existing cash transfer programs or the existing assistance programs, they faced a problem of an eroded legitimacy of systems of administrative targeting. So there was administrative targeting. It was not at a very big scale. It was almost always using officials and notables, right? So there was a very serious problem in the design of these programs, but actually it was a problem ultimately in the ethos of these programs. So there was an institutional framing of these programs, which was cherry picking. And the idea was that officials and notables will find you some of the poor people. And if some of the poor people are the ones you're going to help, then it's fine, it's good enough. At least we're helping some of the poor. As soon as you start thinking in terms of targeting of a universe, what you're saying is that we're using social protection, or we're framing social protection as a right. And therefore, everyone who is below a certain level must have a right to that benefit. And so this issue of cherry picking goes away, or it is delegitimized. And then other operational issues with existing actions, they're thrown up. So there was lots of evidence.
Sorry to interrupt you, but could you finish in 2 minutes, please?
Exactly 2 minutes, yes.
Yeah.
So there was a clear understanding that there were a lot of problems. And the solution that came was to use proxy means test, and the World Bank was a very important innovator in that within Pakistan, and the establishment of the legitimacy of a proxy means test. So initially, just to give you an anecdote, a senior World Bank economist was involved in this, and we were having these discussions at the Planning Commission and the Finance Ministry, and I was saying, but there are errors in this also. There are inclusion errors and exclusion errors even in this. And she said, we're good friends, but she said, "Shut up, Haris. We need to get this through. We need the system to accept the idea of a PMT." And nobody accepted the idea of the PMT in 2008. Everybody accepts it now. It is seen almost as divine wisdom, right? And here I come to the end of my presentation and the problem we're facing now. So now all of the action-oriented problems we have with the PMT. So for example, the issue that Paolo Belli talked about, that how do we move towards a more dynamic system of targeting where the proxy means test is targeting the chronically poor quite well, but it is not responding to our everyday requirements, both in a disaster or in a COVID situation, or there are shifting situations in urban areas. And how do we do that? So the PMT can't do it, except that now the PMT has acquired halo status. So exactly the problem that the PMT solved 15 years ago, it's become part of that same problem again. So the established legitimacy of the PMT now defines this institutional and political framework and the opportunities for change. I'll end here now, and perhaps some of this can be taken up further in discussion. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Harris. Now I want to shift to Samuel Dusengiyumba, who is the Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Local Government in Rwanda.
Thank you very much for having me. Good afternoon. Let me try to share my slides. I hope it will work. I don't see it. Do I have the right to share the slides?
Yeah, you should have that, yeah.
I don't think it's working. Maybe.
Okay, we'll double check that.
Yes, it's because it's not working, but I can share maybe with Claude, who is here, and then he can share for me. Otherwise, I will just proceed with my slides.
Okay, now you should try again now, Samuel, see if it works. We just made you co-host.
Okay. Maybe the issue is my computer. Can you make Jean-Claude the presenter, then you can move the slide for me? Apologies, I'm using a MacBook and has some issues.
So we're just trying to find him in the participants.
Because I've just shared with him the slides.
What's his last name, Samuel?
Is appearing as JC
Oh,
on
Jason.
this?
Okay.
Yes.
JC,
Now we have the slides. Yeah, we have the slides.
All right. Oh, okay. Thank you very much. I'm going to try to catch up with the time I lost. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to appreciate the invitation to this meeting. My name is Samuel. I'm the permanent secretary in the Ministry of Law Government. In terms of background, maybe if you move to the next slide, we just want to tell you that we have been observing, a reducing decrease of poverty within the last survey that we did in 2017. So it means between 2014 and 2017, there was really a decrease that was not very impressive. And this is what I want to talk about as we talk about graduation. Here in Rwanda, we have done a lot of work in terms of reducing poverty since 2000. But when we reached the 2014, we realized that the decrease has really been slowing down. So one of the major issues we realized is the shocks. We have been talking about shocks in terms of climate-related shocks, but now we're seeing other shocks that are even less predictable, such as the current, conflict in the region, the rising of, food prices, and among others. So this is a concern to the social protection interventions for government. We do know that government is responsible for this kind of interventions, but it becomes very hard when you can't predict. We talked about evidence, but then how can evidence even predict the unpredictable? Next slide. When we talk about the graduation, can you pull all the content? We realized that there are a number of constraints. One is awareness. The clients that we're dealing with, sometimes there is so many interventions that they don't even know how to choose what they do and what they don't do. And the will of every client is very important. When you look at what we have been doing across the country, building with collaboration with the stakeholders, such as NGOs, civil society organizations, faith-based organizations, we realize that there is need for building a strong blocks in social protection, because it's not the government. Government alone cannot drive this process of graduation. Another thing is that when the environment is not conducive, when you don't address all the aspects that are around, the household, operating framework, then you cannot make it. So that's why we realized that we needed to change what we've been doing in social protection and equip our social protection policy interventions within this framework of graduation. So how do we intend to do that? The next slide. So our objective within the graduation is to ensure that the poverty, the household under the scheme of social protection, they know their role and responsibilities. We want to be able to work with them to equip them with resources that they need so that they can do what they have to do. Second, we want to ensure that we do things that can be scaled. We need to know where we start and we need to know where we're headed, but also having an agreement with our partners in graduation of the things that needs to happen in a given timeline. Next. Now, our graduation framework, I'm not sure if this slide is legible, but our graduation framework is built on 7 pillars. So we have what we are doing for the customers, or what we call the graduation. By the way, we no longer call them beneficiaries, we call them partners in graduation. There is what we do in terms of transfers, There's what we do in terms of livelihood to ensure that they can have, access to basic services. There is what we do in terms of complementary services. How do we ensure that the environment for all the members of the household is as smooth as possible? There is what we do in terms of really providing, an equally conducive environment around the household, where they can, if you do production, how can you sell? If you need services, how can you access them? But there's something that we work on the client mindset. We need to ensure that they understand their roles and responsibilities, but also coordination is very, very important because there are so many stakeholders that are intervening in social protection, but sometimes they do things in duplicating or, overlapping way, which does not produce the results. Second is learning. How do we capture what we have been learning? How do we ensure that what works in a given, location can be replicated in another location? How do we learn from our mistakes so that we can move forward? So we realize that the outcome of these kind of interventions gives us leverage on really using the few resources that we have and try to achieve, a much faster graduation than in the past. Next. So I talked about coordination, and there is something that we do in Rwanda that is, I think that is very unique, is really bringing all the services, trying to concentrate on the interventions on one household and move to another, but also trying to link all the stakeholders in a way that can allow them to really contribute to the same goal. So this graduation is bringing on board for the first time the private sector. We are bringing on board, investors, so that graduation, is not a business of social protection expert only, but it is a joint intervention where the country can, realize how do we use all the resources that are available? How do we use all the convening power people that we have to grant the graduation? So I would like to pause here. I think this was the last slide. I just wanted to give you a bit of background, but we are here to provide any further input as needed. Thank you very much.
Great. Well, Samuel, thank you very much for helping us improve a bit on our timing. And let me just say, I want to come back to you. We're going to go now to our final presentation, but I want to come back to you at the beginning of the discussion, Samuel, if I can, to follow up on your points about learning and the link to adaptive management. So I wonder if you could just, when we get to discussion, tell us a few things about how you've worked, how you've managed the evidence gathering, work with collaboration with researchers, and so forth, and how that's fed into your management. But let's go first to the final presentation. Rahul Kumar, who, as I said, is the CEO of the Bihar Rural Livelihoods Promotion Initiative, and among several other things. Rahul, very good to have you with us.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes. Thank you for having me today. I'm Rahul Kumar. I'm an officer of Indian Administrative Service, and currently I'm heading an organization called Bihar Rural Livelihood Promotion Society. My organization basically deals with the issues related to socio and economic empowerment of women and also poverty alleviation. I think the presentation was uploaded by Bragg. Yeah. So, yeah, before I come to the SJY program for ultra poor in being done in the state of Bihar, let me highlight briefly about the institutional architecture of my organization, that is popularly known as Jivika. So we have 3 layers of community-based organization. At the bottom, we have self-help groups, which is constituted by 10 to 15 women. And primarily, the mandate for self-help group is to instill habit of saving in women and household as whole. And also we ensure the credit linkage of these self-help groups to the bank. So today we have, in last 15 years, we have more than 1.45 million self-help groups with a membership of 12.30 million. So since we include 1 woman in each household, so the practical coverage of these SSGs are approx 60 to 65 million, which is half of the population of Bihar. The secondary layer, which deals with the food security, health security, and also convergence with the departmental schemes, is called village organization. And today we have roughly 69,000 primary level federation, that is VO. At apex level, we have CLF, that is cluster level federation. It is this comprises almost 4,000 to 7,000 women and 30 to 35 VO. So these CLFs work as economic clusters and ensure the enhancement in economical activities among household. Next. So as you can see that Jivika model is itself a very impactful model for poverty elevation. But what triggered us to adopt SJY in 2016-17, when a World Bank project, that is BRLP, Bihar Rural Bihar Rural Livelihood Project, was coming to its closure. So we conducted a study among 23 villages just to get an idea that what was the status of inclusion. So to our surprise, 841 households were excluded, and out of these 841 households, 8% of households were not having enough money to do the mandatory saving. That is a mandatory saving is an indicator to become a member in SHG. So we started a pilot in 2 blocks, and based on the result of these pilots and also the learnings from internationally adopted graduation approach, we initiated SJY, that is Satat Jivikoparjan Yojana, as known locally. So this program aims to provide sustainable livelihood to ultra poor families, and the state government of Bihar initiated this program in 2018. Next.
Right, they just don't think that they're gonna.
It doesn't seem to be filling Rahul the slide.
I think there's some problem.
No.
Can I share screen from my side?
That's fine.
Yes, I'm trying to share my. Yeah, is this visible?
Yes, it is.
Yeah. So to identify the eligible household under SJY, we made some indicators. So the household monthly income had to be less than $40.
Sorry, Rahul, we're only seeing your title slide. So if you want to speak to a particular slide, we need to move to that.
It's not moving. Is it visible now?
Just the title slide is visible. And I don't know if going into presentation mode. Okay, now we see that. Now we see the slide.
Okay, okay, fine. So the first indicator for the eligible household under SJY was to have household monthly income less than 3,000 rupees or $40. These households were primarily having single income source, and mostly these families were landless or they were having just bare minimum land. These households were also facing food security issues, and these families were majorly excluded families. When we say excluded, it means they were having no access to most of the government schemes. So we adopted this division approach, and we designed 24 months of structured parameters. Like we involved our CBOs, the 3-layer CBOs, which I mentioned earlier, in identification of the eligible household. Then we also selected MRP, that is Master Resource Person. They are mainly community members, and 30 to 35 households were marked with one particular MRP. Then we also surveyed market, and we also surveyed this household for their existing set of skills and the required set of skills. We also did the market survey, and market linkage planning was also done. Then we developed in-house mobile-based MIS just to track the household visit of MRP and also the progress of these SJY families. So social integration was done in a span of 24 months. Then we also provided household support. Saving accounts were opened for all these families, and we conducted financial literacy training program as well. So enterprise development training was one of the key components when we were designing the training program. And outcomes of the SJY program so far has been very impactful. Most of the families have witnessed the rise in earnings. Their assets were diversified, and the food security issue, health risk issues were also minimized. And we ensured that these families got a proper linkage with government schemes.
Rahul, could I ask you to finish in 2 minutes, please?
Yes, sure. So these are the salient features of the SJY model, which I roughly have already spoken. And impact-wise, we endorsed more than 155,000 families. And number-wise, this is the world largest government-owned graduation program for ultra-poor. 97% of families have already got their bank accounts opened. And these accounts are seeded with the national identity card so that they are eligible to get benefits of social security schemes. They also got 97% of the families got entrepreneurial training, and 95% families got their ration card under National Food Security Act. We, for the first 7 months, we provided livelihood gap assistance fund, 1,000 rupees per month per family. And 90% of these endorsed family have already got their asset transferred, like micro enterprises, cattle, e-rickshaw. So these are the findings because we did it in a scaled up manner. So we got the political engagement. Our state government supported this program from day one and in full measures. Again, we knew it that through our own sources, we cannot scale it up. So we ensured the departmental convergence, mainly farm sector, livestock, welfare department schemes were converged under this program. We also focused on the system strengthening, and for partnership, we got technical inputs from JPAL South Asia, again Bandhan Konagar, and BRAC supported us in this scheme. So this is the brief presentation on Sataj Upajan Yojana from my side. Thank you.
Very good, Rahul. Thanks very much. Well, thank you to all the presenters, both in the first initial research section and then in this most recent policy section. Awful lot of sort of interesting ideas and evidence has been presented, and far more than we'll have time, unfortunately, to discuss. We only have about 10 minutes just over for the discussion. I'd like us to focus right in on just one of the various issues that I think would be interesting to discuss, and that is the use of evidence research in driving policy. And I wonder, Samuel, if I could come to you first. You talked about learning approaches and how that's an important part of the overall structure that you've created. You also linked learning to adaptive management. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit generally about learning internally, but then in particular about learning with external partners, so research collaborations and that sort of thing. So maybe just for 2 minutes, and then and Nadir, I'd like to come to you if I could after that to share your experience. You also mentioned some of the research agenda items that you have and where you think research is most needed. And of course, a lot of what you've done, we know about your collaborations with Adnan Khan and others, and just wonder if you could talk a bit about the historical research collaborations and where they have been most useful in helping to influence and drive policy. So first, Samuel, if we could come to you.
Thank you very much for this. First is in Rwanda, we have what we call homegrown solutions. It is that we believe that people in a given location can find solutions that are very relevant to their situation. So we really very serious on that, and we give people a chance to try things that they see fit. And once we see that it is working, we work with the local communities to document that kind of experience so that we can share it with other districts. Because in Rwanda, our decentralization structure is that the district is the major local government structure. So once a district has tried something successfully, we document it. Then in the meeting, in the coordination meeting, we give a chance to that district to share. For example, I can talk about what we call the Girinka. Girinka is one cow per family. We have seen that when you give a cow to a poor household, the cow can really have, faster effect in terms of graduation. Second is the coordination we have with stakeholders, development partners, NGOs. We have what we call the sector working groups. We have what the social protection sector working groups. This is a framework of discussion where we meet with different stakeholders, and on quarterly basis, we have a chance to look at the research or evidence that has been collected by our different stakeholders, and we share it. And we encourage our stakeholders and government, including local government and districts, to replicate what has been working perfectly with other institutions. So I think at these levels, we have a chance to really see what works and try to replicate it. But also we put a lot of effort in terms of learning from research like the one published by World Bank, under the development partners, to see where we can improve on what we do. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Samuel. So Nadia, before coming to just Claire, I wonder if I could then bring you in after him to talk from your perspective about learning collaborations with government partners. Nadir, in terms of your experience with the PPAF, what have been sort of the most important collaborations around evidence and research in terms of driving policy?
Okay, well, thank you. In fact, as I mentioned, that the government of Pakistan, based on the lessons learned of social action program, decided to create an apex institution, which was PPF. So it was basically creation of institutions at the to promote bottom-up approach. So in 1997, based on the result of social action program, PPF was created. And then we started different set of interventions in country, as I mentioned, that microfinance and through small infrastructure. But later on in 2016, we realized that we need to go to household level poverty reduction. And that's where graduation program was introduced. So based on result of various evaluation studies, there was not any specific research, but mostly the evaluations done by World Bank, by Italian, by various donors. Based on that, then government of Pakistan realized that the graduation model, there is a big social protection program, which is called Benazir Income Support Program. So the government also thought that, there should be an approach of exit from Benazir Income Support Program, from social protection to graduation. So that's where PPF came. We piloted various initiatives with the support of World Bank and some other donors. And then government basically got convinced, and this National Poverty Graduation Program, which I showed in one of the slides, that's where, government basically got loan from IFAD, and the National Poverty Graduation Program was launched at the national level. And now government is thinking, and at the highest policy level, there is realization that this social protection program of BISP needs to be concluded over a period of time, but adopting the approach of graduation. Having said that, I also added in my slide, which I can now tell, that we need, there is a need for a longitudinal study, what happened to the project beneficiaries over last 3 to 5 years after the project ended. And also, I think we need to involve academia, students, thesis backed by researchers to look at all these impacts that have been created. And one thing which I'll just mention, which is not really respond to your question, but rather my own learning, I really got impressed from the Ghana experience of graduation. It's holistic. And what I see in Pakistan, the missing link is, as I mentioned earlier, that until unless you address multidimensional poverty in those areas, only cash transfer or graduation approach doesn't work. Because as I mentioned, if there is any illness in family or there is any disaster, it brings all these efforts to zero-sum game. So that is something which we need to look at, and that's what we are trying to advocate with Government of Pakistan also, to not only upscale the graduation approach, but at the same time invest in multidimensional poverty reduction interventions. Thank you.
Lydia, thanks very much. Claire.
Sure, I'll try to be brief because we have such a richness of contributions on the call this morning. I think there's a few things to flag. We're moving into this space where really we see governments playing around with a lot of what has been called trade-offs, but I think also the contextualization of graduation, thinking about what the heterogeneity of poverty traps looks like in their context, what the implications are for design and delivery. And so I think we're moving from a space where we've built up a very strong evidence base for the design and delivery of graduation programs, and we're now looking at how that connects into the particular multidimensional nature of poverty in different contexts, but also very importantly with the way in which government programming, policy decisions, but also programming decisions, investments, et cetera, are made. We have multiple forms for that, but I think they need to grow. And we've got this need for increased peer learning across governments. Nadir's just mentioned the Ghana example. I think that's a nice way of looking at it. So looking and learning how other governments are doing this. SJY, for example, heading over and having a look at what's happening in Bihar and how the government there has scaled graduation through their systems and approaches. From the evidence side, we have about 20 years now of evidence from the CGAP studies and many more emerging about the design and delivery. We have just released a PEI publication drawing out some of the insights from NGOs supporting governments to design and deliver graduation programs. And that just came out this week, I think, and that shares experiences from Fundación Capital, from Village Enterprise and others, but looking specifically at this issue of some of the trade-offs that have been mentioned and some of the questions that governments need to grapple with as they think about making these investments in their countries. So I suppose for me, that next step is the one that Harris was talking around policy and the connection with action and how we're taking the scientific evidence base, which is actually enormously strong for this kind of approach, and thinking about how we tailor it to the context that we're hoping to work in. So UPGI and BRAC more generally, and I think a lot of the actors working in this space, and of course LSE as well, I think are starting to offer this platform where this cross-pollination can happen. And today's call has been a great example of that. So thanks very much for hosting.
Great, thanks, Claire. So just quickly, if I could bring in first Harris and then Rahul, where, if you had to name just two things, so I'm asking you to keep your response to 1 minute, where do you think new evidence and new research is most needed or would be most useful? So first Harris and then Rahul, and then quickly, Paolo, also to you.
I can give you my sense of where we will be in terms of social protection programming in Pakistan.
Okay.
The Benazir Income Support Program has, for example, adopted this idea of a dynamic social registry, which means that they want to move away from a static understanding of a poverty, a proxy means test, to something more dynamic. So I think that we're really at that point where the question will be asked as to what constitutes valid evidence or valid knowledge of how we target. So I think that the idea of a static score which you do every 48 months, I think that's it's already seen its day. It'll be a while before this is articulated through the system, but actually the work has to start now. So I see that both in my discussions at the Benazir Income Support Program and also the work that we're doing in the provincial level. And as we move into complex programs, we will need to have more complex ways of targeting. And that again would require not only evidence, but also proper understanding of what the evidence is telling us.
Great, thanks very much, Harris. Rahul, any quick thoughts yourself on this, and where evidence would be most useful in research?
Yes, thank you. So the research or evidence can show the best practices around, and also the efficiency which we gain through the integrated approach. So in the short span of 4 years of SJY, as I mentioned in my presentation, that the positive change in the household income or the increase in saving of the household or formal linkage with the bank, their linkage with other schemes like housing schemes, livestock, the convergence thing. So the evidence is very much clear, and when we present it to the government, so the policy makers are bound to accept the outcome, and hence we showcased the positive impact of this scheme at state government level. And recently, the central government of India, also showed interest in our SJY program. And just on 6th of March, one other state of India has invited us to showcase SJY program, where my team members are also going. So yes, the numbers speak at their own. And I think we don't need any other evidence to state the success of this kind of graduation program for ultra poor families.
Great. Thanks very much. Quickly, Nadir, you have your hand up, but just 30 seconds, and then to Paolo.
Just one comment. Well, I think there's wealth of information available and success stories around the globe. I think what needs to be done is that mostly the international institutions, financial institutions like World Bank or Asian Development Bank, they put a lot of money on social protection. But I think this is time that based on the evidence which has already been created around the globe, including Pakistan. So these institutions also have to play their role to convince the government, because we do our policy advocacy, but when it comes from the international financial institution, it does create an impact. So I think World Bank, IMF, and other international financial institutions also need to advocate and lobby with governments across the globe to transform these social protection program into graduation model, and also the addressing multidimensional poverty. Thank you.
Okay, well, that's a question we can put directly to Paolo. Should the bank be doing more? Paolo.
Yeah, so answering your previous question, for me, the key questions still out there, really important to look into, are around scaling. So what is the effectiveness of large-scale government-led programs? What are the factors in the delivery that allow for scalable solutions? So, for example, as I mentioned earlier, the role of technology, and also the bundling of interventions. Now, what should be like what is the marginal contribution, let's say, of constituent interventions, and what is the minimum appropriate bundle for a scalable program, and also related to the targeting, what you were saying before. Now, what is the cost effectiveness of these programs across different population groups, for example, urban, rural, etc. So for me, the issue of scalability and how to have the most cost-effective solution in scaling up are the key questions still open.
Great. Thanks very much, Paolo. So we're just out of time. So let me just thank again all the speakers today, and to thank all of you also who participated. I'm sorry, we normally like to come to you also for your contributions and questions, but the very tight format today didn't allow for that. But I want to thank you all for joining. But let me just close with a big thanks to the speakers on both the research side and the policy side, but also to all of our co-hosts for this seminar. So Breck in particular, but also closer to home here, both Stickard and the LSE. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.